Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Section 1. What does it mean for a god to fear? There is a question sitting underneath all of Warhammer 40,000 lore that most people never think to ask. It hides behind the bloodshed and the galaxy-shaking battles, behind the gold armor of space marines and the crumbling icons of a dying empire. The question is this: can the Emperor of mankind actually fear something? Not concern, not strategic caution, not the calculated recognition that a threat needs to be neutralized. Real fear, the kind that changes your behavior, not because you've run the odds and made a rational decision, but because something sits in your chest at night and won't let you think clearly. The kind that makes even a god-level intelligence do something irrational. Because if you read the lore carefully enough, there is exactly one Primarch whose existence seemed to genuinely unsettle the Emperor in a way that went beyond chess piece thinking. Not Horus, who the Emperor loved perhaps more than any of his other sons, and whose betrayal cracked the Emperor's certainty so deeply that he couldn't believe it, even with the evidence in front of him. Not Lorgar, whose religious devotion was an embarrassment the Emperor mostly wanted to stamp out. Not Angron, whose rage made him a weapon pointed at enemies rather than a threat to the Emperor's plans. Not even the chaos-touched Primarchs who eventually turned. The one who unsettled the Emperor at a fundamental level was Magnus the Red. And the way you can tell that is not from a single dramatic scene or a line of dialogue where the Emperor confesses his anxiety. The way you can tell is by looking at what the Emperor did around Magnus, specifically when Magnus wasn't looking. Because the Emperor of mankind, who is in most interpretations of the lore, a being of near-omniscient psychic power who has been planning the shape of human history for tens of thousands of years, made a series of choices around Magnus that only make sense if there was an element of genuine uncertainty. An element of something the Emperor couldn't completely control or predict. He kept his greatest secret from all his sons, every single one of them, including his most loyal and brilliant. But with Magnus, that secrecy carried an extra dimension. The Emperor needed Magnus, perhaps more than any other Primarch, for the thing he was building in secret under the Imperial Palace. And yet he also feared what Magnus might become. He feared what Magnus might discover. He feared what Magnus might do with the knowledge he was accumulating at a pace that even the Emperor found difficult to track. And so the Emperor did something that, when you look at it plainly, is almost impossible to justify any other way. At the Council of Nicaea, while Magnus stood in that ancient stone amphitheater, making the case for the legitimacy of psychic practice, the Emperor had Leman Russ hidden in the crowd, concealed by a retinue of Sisters of Silence, so that Magnus couldn't sense him, psychically, waiting, in case Magnus reacted badly, in case Magnus lost his temper, in case Magnus, upon hearing a verdict he disagreed with, decided to do something that needed to be stopped by the most physically powerful and combat-aggressive of all the Primarchs. Think about what that actually means. The Emperor brought his executioner to the trial and hid him in the audience. That is not how you treat a son you trust. That is not how you treat a subordinate you feel comfortable with. That is how you treat someone whose potential reactions you genuinely cannot predict. Someone whose capabilities operate in a domain that even you find difficult to fully account for. This is a video about that someone. About the copper-skinned, one-eyed Primarch who spent his mortal life trying to use the most dangerous force in the universe to protect the people he loved, who destroyed his father's greatest project through an act of pure loyalty, and who has spent 10,000 years since then as a prisoner of his own choices and a champion of a god he never chose. This is the story of Magnus the Red. Take a breath, get comfortable, because this one goes deep. Section 2, Before the Beginning, the Crimson Child of Prospero. To understand what Magnus became and why the Emperor related to him the way he did, you need to understand where Magnus came from. And his origin is unlike any other Primarchs, even in a group where unusual origins are essentially standard. When the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarchs from the Emperor's gene lab on Terra, hurling them across the galaxy as infants in their developmental capsules, most of them landed somewhere and had no memory of the journey. They were infants, blank slates, absorbed into whatever world they fell upon and shaped by it. Lemon Russ was found by wolves in the frozen wastes of Fenris and raised as a feral child until he was eventually taken in by the local people. Horus landed on a world and was found by a noble family. Lorgar found himself on a world where faith in something greater than humanity was the currency of survival. Magnus was different in a way that has no parallel among his brothers. Magnus was conscious during his transit through the warp. He remembers it. He remembers his own creation. He remembers the Emperor's hands on his genes, the specific shape of his early consciousness, the sensation of being a mind aware of itself before it had a body to call home. And he was already communicating psychically with the Emperor during his gestation, a connection that existed mind to mind before the two ever met in physical space. When his capsule finally came to rest, it landed on Prospero. And if you were going to custom design a world to receive a being like Magnus, you could not have done better. Prospero was a colony world settled by refugees, but a very specific kind. The people who had chosen this distant, difficult planet were human psychers, individuals who could touch the warp and shape reality with their minds, who had fled there because in most of the rest of human space during the Age of Strife, being a psyker was not a gift. It was a death sentence. Mobs drove them out of cities. Governments rounded them up. The fear and superstition that surrounded psychic ability in a galaxy where uncontrolled psychic power genuinely could open doorways for things that wanted to eat your soul was, in many ways, quite rational. But rational or not, it meant that Prospero's founders had chosen isolation over execution, had built a civilization on a difficult world specifically because it was far enough away from everyone else that they could be left alone. By the time Magnus arrived, Prospero had developed into something remarkable. The psychers who had settled it across the generations had built cities of stone and glass and crystalline energy, had created libraries of extraordinary depth, had developed frameworks for understanding and disciplining psychic ability that were more sophisticated than almost anything else in the human sphere. They were scholars by nature, academics by culture, deeply devoted to the idea that knowledge was the most precious thing in the universe. That understanding the rules of reality, including the terrifying rules of the warp, was better than hiding from them. Magnus fell among his people. He grew up quickly, even by Primarch standards, and his psychic talent manifested almost immediately. He absorbed the curriculum of Prospero's scholars at a speed that left his teachers breathless. Then he overtook them. Not arrogantly, or at least not at first. Magnus was by nature an extravagantly curious person. He wanted to understand everything, not to dominate it or control it, but because the act of understanding itself was deeply satisfying to him. He read everything. He asked questions constantly. He engaged in long philosophical debates with scholars who had been studying these subjects for their entire lives, and within a few years, he was asking them questions they couldn't answer. He didn't just draw power from the warp, the way most psychers did. He looked into it. He studied it. He treated the churning infinite sea of psychic energy as an object of intellectual inquiry rather than purely a tool, and what he saw there was genuinely different from what others had observed. Because Magnus was not just an extremely powerful psyker, though he certainly was that. He was an extremely intelligent one, and intelligence applied to the warp yields insights that raw power alone cannot access. His first major act of leadership on Prospero was a campaign to rid the planet of a species called the Psychnuaean, a form of alien creature that had been preying on Prospero's psyker population for generations. They had overrun early cities, reduced entire communities to hosts for their eggs, and lived on the psychic energy of human minds in a way that was both horrifying and ecologically devastating for a planet where almost everyone had psychic sensitivity. Magnus organized and led the extermination of these creatures, not through brute force alone, but through careful study of their behavior, their vulnerabilities, their psychic signatures, and the most efficient way to deny them the environment they needed to reproduce. It was the first time, but far from the last, that Magnus would demonstrate his particular genius, which was not just power, but the application of understanding to problems that pure strength couldn't solve. By the time the Emperor's Great Crusade arrived at Prospero, Magnus was already the defining figure of the planet. He had transformed Prospero's academies into something extraordinary, had built the great library of Tizca into a repository of knowledge from across the human sphere, and had taken in the soldiers who would become his 1,000 sons, and begun training them not just as warriors, but as scholars. The 1,000 sons were an unusual force, even by the standards of the space. Marine legions. They weren't just soldiers who also happened to have psychic ability. They were, in their self-conception and their culture, an order of scholars who also happened to be deadly. Their libraries went with them on campaign. Their officers wrote philosophy. Their chaplains debated the nature of the warp in annotated margins of books they carried through firefights. But before all of that, before the crusade arrived, before Magnus was given his legion, there were already problems forming beneath the surface of this perfect arrangement. The 1,000 sons that Magnus inherited, men created from his own gene seed, were carrying a flaw. It was called the flesh change, and it was exactly as terrible as the name implies. Gradually, without warning, members of the Legion would begin to mutate, not in the direction of controlled enhancement, not in ways that improved their combat capability or their intelligence, but in ways that were random, violent, and ultimately catastrophic. A man's bones would begin to reshape themselves. His skin would split and regrow in configurations that were no longer quite human. In the worst cases, the flesh change would accelerate beyond anything that could be survived, and what had been a proud Astartes would dissolve into a screaming, formless mass of flesh and bone that would eventually have to be destroyed. These lost warriors were called Chaos Spawn, though at this early stage of the Imperium, no one yet had that vocabulary. They were called the Broken Ones, the Consumed. Magnus was horrified by this. These were his sons, his gene children, his responsibility. He dedicated enormous energy to studying the problem, to understanding why his gene seed produced this effect in some of his warriors, to finding a way to stop it. He brought the full force of his intellect to bear on what was essentially a biological and psychic crisis. And the number of active warriors in his legion dwindled as the flesh change claimed more of them, threatening to reduce the 1,000 sons to a pale shadow of their potential before they had even truly begun. In desperation, he went into the warp looking for answers. What he found, or what found him, was an entity that offered him a deal. "Give me your eye," it said, or something to that effect, "and I will give your sons relief from the flesh change." Magnus, who was brilliant but young, who had studied the warp but had not yet grasped the depth of its treacheries, who wanted desperately to save his legion, accepted. He gave up his right eye. The mutations went into remission. His sons stabilized. The crisis receded, at least for now. The entity he had bargained with was Tzench, the chaos god of change, of sorcery, of manipulation, of plans within plans within plans. The bargain that felt like a victory was actually the first move in a game Magnus wouldn't understand the rules of for decades. His right eye socket remained empty, and he wore that absence as a mark of the price he'd paid, the price of love and desperation. The Emperor had warned him about the dangers of dealing with powers in the warp. Magnus had heard the warning and believed he had been smart enough to beat the odds. He hadn't. But he didn't know that yet. And when the Emperor finally arrived on Prospero, when the two of them met in physical space for the first time, the reunion was unlike anything between the Emperor and any other Primarch. It was immediate. It was warm. It was two minds that had already been in conversation for years, reaching across the galaxy in psychic whispers. finally having the chance to look at each other with their actual eyes. Or, in Magnus's case, his actual eye. Section 3. The Reunion. Father and son, mind to mind. There is a description of the moment the Emperor set foot on Prospero that appears in the lore, and it is one of the more quietly remarkable passages in all of 40k's history. When the Emperor's fleet arrived and the Emperor himself stepped onto the Isods, surface of that distant scholar's world, he and Magnus immediately greeted each other, not as strangers meeting for the first time, but as old friends reuniting after a long absence. They embraced. They spoke to each other with the familiarity of people who already knew the contours of each other's minds, as indeed they did, in the mind, if not in the flesh. Because of that psychic connection established before Magnus was even born, before his developmental capsule was scattered across the galaxy, those two had been in contact on some level across what must have been an extraordinary distance. Magnus, growing up on Prospero, had always known at some deep level that there was someone out there who he was reaching toward. The Emperor, working on Terra, had always had some awareness of this particular son's extraordinary mind radiating out through the warp. It is important to understand the depth of this relationship in its early form, because it is the foundation of everything that comes after. The Emperor and Magnus were not just father and son in the biological sense of a Primarch being a gene child of the Emperor. They were psychic contemporaries in a way that was unique among the Primarchs. The Emperor was the greatest psyker in the history of humanity, a being who had been building his psychic capabilities across tens of thousands of years of reincarnation and practice and deliberate development. Magnus was the greatest natural psychic talent in human history below the Emperor, a being who had been born with abilities that made him almost incomprehensible to everyone around him. They could understand each other in ways that no one else fully could. They could reach into the warp together and share what they perceived there, pointing at structures and currents and entities, the way two astronomers might share a telescope and debate what they were seeing in a particular nebula. The Emperor gave Magnus access to knowledge and frameworks that Magnus had been developing independently on Prospero, and found in Magnus someone who could engage with that knowledge at its actual level, rather than requiring it to be simplified. What the Emperor was less forthcoming about was the danger. He taught Magnus technique and theory. He did not fully explain the nature of the entities that existed in the warp, or at least not completely. Whether this was strategic, or whether it reflected the Emperor's own complex relationship with knowledge about chaos, is something the lore leaves deliberately ambiguous. The official ideology of the Great Crusade was the imperial truth, the doctrine that science and reason were the foundations of civilization, and that the supernatural did not exist in any meaningful sense. Demons were psychic phenomena, not literal beings with their own agency. The warp was a dimension of psychic energy, not a place where gods and monsters had their own interior lives and their own desires about what humanity should be. Magnus didn't fully accept this. He had been looking into the warp for years before the Emperor arrived, and what he saw there did not match the description of a purely mechanistic phenomena. He saw patterns too complex to be random. He saw what looked disturbingly like intent. He kept his conclusions mostly to himself, partly because they were difficult to articulate in ways that would satisfy the skeptics around him, and partly because he sensed that his father's commitment to the imperial truth ran very deep and might be more than just philosophical. Still, in those early years, the relationship between Magnus and the Emperor was the closest and most intellectually equal that the Emperor had with any of his sons. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The Emperor would spend time at Prospero in ways he didn't at other worlds, engaging with its libraries, its scholars, its culture of careful and disciplined inquiry. He seemed to find something at Prospero that he found nowhere else in the Imperium, a place where the conversation could be had at his actual level, not a simplified version of it. And Magnus, for his part, devoted himself to the Emperor's project with something approaching love. He believed in what the Great Crusade was doing. He believed in the idea of a humanity liberated from the isolation of the age of strife, reunited across the stars, given the tools of reason and knowledge to protect itself from the things that lurked in the dark. He believed in it so completely that it would later lead him to destroy it by trying to protect it. When Magnus was formally given command of the Thousand Sons and the Legion began its work in the Great Crusade, he carried this devotion into the field with a particular approach. The Thousand Sons did not prefer conquest through simple devastation. They preferred compliance over destruction wherever possible, studied their targets before engaging, attempted negotiation in cases where other legions would have simply landed, and started shooting. They were not soft, and when they fought, they were devastatingly effective. Magnus was a terrifying presence on a battlefield, a being of immense physical power who also had psychic capabilities that most enemies couldn't even conceptualize, let alone counter. But the Thousand Sons' first preference was always understanding. Their second preference was a precise and targeted application of force. Total destruction was a last resort. This made them unusual in the Great Crusade's culture, and unusualness in that context attracted attention of a certain kind. There were brothers who found the Thousand Sons troubling, not just annoying, not just philosophically divergent, but genuinely troubling. Mortarion, who had spent his entire childhood on a world ruled by a warlord who used psychic-adjacent powers to torture and dominate the population, who had fought his way to freedom against that warlord and developed a bone-deep revulsion for anything that operated the way. That warlord had operated, looked at the Thousand Sons, and saw something that activated every alarm in his psyche. He was not irrational in this, or at least not entirely. He had seen what happened when individuals with extraordinary power operated without adequate checks. He didn't trust it. He didn't trust the Thousand Sons, and he especially didn't trust their Primarch. Leman Russ was different. Leman Russ was not operating from trauma the way Mortarion was. Russ simply found Magnus irritating in a way that gradually deepened into genuine antagonism over the years. Part of this was cultural. The Space Wolves' identity was built around a very specific kind of warrior virtue, an emphasis on physical courage, direct confrontation, and a certain contempt for trickery or indirection. Sorcery, in the Fenrisian cultural framework that Russ had grown up within and that permeated his legion, was the tool of those who wouldn't face you honestly. It was the weapon of entities that had earned deep contempt, something for the cowardly and the untrustworthy. Magnus embodied everything about that. He was clever, he was indirect, he deployed psychic powers that couldn't be blocked by physical toughness, and he tended to be intellectually dismissive of people he thought were less intelligent than he was, which in practice was most people. The tensions between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons built across the years of the Great Crusade, breaking into something approaching open violence at a place called Arc Reach Secundus, where Magnus and Russ came to within a hair's breadth of a physical confrontation over the fate of a planetary library. Only Lorgar's intervention prevented blood being shed there. The Emperor had to take notice, and he did. Section 4. The Great Crusade. A scholar among warriors. The Great Crusade was, at its heart, a military project. 100 Space Marine legions thundering across the galaxy, bringing lost human worlds back into a fold that hadn't existed a century earlier, crushing alien empires that had filled the vacuum of the Age of Strife, painting the galaxy in the gold and red of an expanding human empire. The Primarchs who thrived in that environment were, by and large, the ones whose gifts mapped most directly onto the project's core demands. Horus, who was brilliant at large-scale coordination and had an almost supernatural ability to make other people want to follow him. Robuta Gilliman, whose administrative genius and tactical precision turned warfare into something almost mechanical in its efficiency. Angron and Russ and Perturabo, whose temperaments made them almost perfectly suited to the sustained application of violence. Magnus fit awkwardly into this framework, not because he was ineffective. His Thousand Sons were genuinely extraordinary on campaign. They could do things other legions simply couldn't. Magnus himself on a battlefield was a phenomenon that commanders on the other side had no doctrine for. He could reach across physical space and touch enemy minds. He could perceive threats before they manifested. He could operate through proxies across distances that made conventional command structures look primitive. At certain moments in the Great Crusade, operations that would have cost enormous amounts of blood and time and ships were completed by the Thousand Sons, with minimal casualties, because Magnus simply saw things that no one else could see and acted on that information with precision. But the Great Crusade's culture was not built around that kind of contribution. The metrics were victories. The symbols of status were the stars brought into compliance. The stories that got told were the ones with dramatic charges and personal duels and legions crashing against each other in open terrain. The Thousand Sons' victories were often quiet, over before they were fully understood, achieved through methods that their allies couldn't follow and that looked disturbingly like the kinds of things the enemy sometimes did. And there was something else. As the Great Crusade pushed further from terror, it encountered an ever-growing variety of alien species, and among those species were many who had their own relationship with the warp. Warp-touched creatures, demons in the service of forces that the official ideology of the Imperium insisted didn't really exist as genuine agents with their own intentions. Sorcerers and witches and things that had no names in any human language. The legions encountered these things on dozens of worlds, and each time they did, the uncomfortable parallel between the powers deployed by these entities and the powers deployed by the Thousand Sons became more visible. It was in this context that certain voices in the Crusade began to say things out loud that had previously only been whispered. Mortarion was among the loudest. The Thousand Sons, he argued, were no different in kind from the things the Great Crusade was supposed to be, cleansing the galaxy of. They were sorcerers. They trafficked with warp entities. They called what they did by different names and dressed it in the language of science and discipline. But the substance was the same. They were a corruption at the heart of the Imperium, and the Crusade would eventually pay the price for tolerating them. Russ agreed, though from a different place and with different emphasis. For him, it was not primarily a philosophical argument about the nature of psychic power. It was simpler than that. He didn't trust Magnus. He never had, really. The Arc Reach Secundus incident had crystallized something that had been building for years. And after that near confrontation, Russ made no particular effort to hide his contempt for the Thousand Sons or their Primarch. Magnus was not passive in the face of this. He was, in fact, the most vigorous defender of psychic practice in the entire Imperium, and he argued his case with the full force of his extraordinary intellect. His position was nuanced and, honestly, largely correct on the facts. Psychic ability was not inherently corrupting. The danger was in undisciplined use, in bargaining with entities one didn't understand, in treating the warp as a resource to be exploited without caution rather than a domain to be carefully navigated. The Thousand Sons' entire culture was built around discipline, understanding, and the systematic reduction of the risks involved. Banning psychic practice wouldn't make psychers safer. It would just make them unguided, which was actually more dangerous. He was largely correct about this. The post-heresy Imperium would eventually come to accept a version of his argument when it reversed the Nicaea decrees and reinstated librarians across the chapters. But in the moment, being correct about the facts wasn't enough to override the fear and the distrust and the accumulated weight of genuine examples of psychic power going catastrophically wrong. There are a few moments from this period that deserve particular attention because they illuminate something important about who Magnus was and how he operated. One of these is his relationship with Lorgar. The two Primarchs were in many ways temperamental companions, both deeply invested in questions of meaning and metaphysics, both marginalized by a crusade culture that valued pragmatic results over philosophical inquiry. Magnus and Lorgar had extended conversations about the nature of the warp, about the entities that existed within it, about the relationship between psychic power and what Lorgar had begun to think of as divinity. Magnus was genuinely concerned about where Lorgar's thinking was heading. He could see that his brother was beginning to approach something that Magnus himself had approached and pulled back from. The recognition that the great powers in the warp were not simply forces to be used, but entities with their own interests that could and would use you back. Magnus warned Lorgar, he said, in various forms over various conversations, that what Lorgar was reaching toward would destroy him. He wasn't saying this as a committed rationalist defending the Imperial truth. Magnus didn't fully believe the Imperial truth himself. He was saying it as someone who had looked further into the warp than Lorgar had, and seen what was waiting at the end of the path Lorgar was choosing. Lorgar didn't listen. He was too far gone, already too deep in the embrace of forces that had decided he was exactly what they needed. And Magnus, who had warned him and failed to save him, would have to live with that. Another moment that deserves attention is the Book of Magnus. Throughout the Great Crusade, Magnus compiled what became an extraordinary document, a massive compendium of everything he had learned and discovered about the warp, its nature, its inhabitants, its rules and the exceptions to those rules, the techniques he had developed for engaging with it safely and effectively. He drew on everything the scholars of Prospero had accumulated across generations, everything he had observed and deduced himself, everything he had gathered from alien civilizations whose relationship with psychic power sometimes yielded insights that human frameworks had missed. The Book of Magnus was, in many ways, the most complete and accurate map of the warp that had ever been compiled by a mortal mind. It was also, later, the tool that Ahriman would use to destroy what was left of the Legion. But that is a story for later. What the Book of Magnus represents in this period is a sustained act of intellectual ambition. Magnus genuinely believed that understanding the warp was not just possible, but essential. That humanity could not safely navigate a galaxy permeated with psychic energy while pretending that energy didn't exist or didn't have structure. That the Imperial truth, whatever its virtues as a social and political framework, was lying about the nature of reality in ways that would eventually cost humanity enormously. He was trying to do the work of honest inquiry because he believed that the consequences of dishonest inquiry, or of no inquiry at all, would be catastrophic. He was also right about this, but being right in 40,000 is rarely sufficient protection against consequences. One more thing about this period. Magnus's relationship with Horus was genuinely warm, at least in its early phases. Of all his brothers, Horus was probably the one Magnus felt most comfortable with intellectually, which is interesting because in personality terms, they couldn't have been more different. Horus was all action and charisma and the sheer force of presence that made you want to follow him. Magnus was contemplative and interior, and sometimes difficult to access emotionally, but they respected each other. Horus recognized Magnus's capabilities and didn't make the mistake of dismissing him the way some of their brothers did. Magnus found Horus's leadership impressive in a way that was free of the resentment that sometimes complicated his relationships with Primarchs he considered less gifted than himself. This makes what happens next, and what Magnus tries to do about it, all the more devastating. Section 5. The Council of Nicaea. The predetermined trial. The Council of Nicaea happened in approximately the year 1 of the 31st millennium, which means it took place right at the boundary between the Great Crusade's triumphant middle period and the gathering darkness of what would become the Horus heresy. The emperor called it, in his capacity as arbiter, to settle once and for all the question that had been dividing his legions for years. Were psychic powers a legitimate tool of the Imperium, or were they an unacceptable danger that needed to be outlawed? Nicaea itself was an appropriate choice of venue, one of those quiet ironies that lore writers seem to enjoy scattering through the setting. The name echoes the real-world Council of Nicaea, the gathering in the 4th century where the early Christian church made critical decisions about doctrine and orthodoxy, decisions that shaped the religion for the next 17 centuries and counting. The parallel is not an accident. Nicaea in 40k is where doctrines get set, where orthodoxy gets defined, where the empire decides what it officially believes and how it officially behaves. The emperor arrived and took his place on a great dais above a natural amphitheatre large enough to hold tens of thousands. Malcador the Sigillite was present, the emperor's most trusted advisor and the second most powerful human psyker alive. The Primarchs gathered. The legion commanders gathered. Representatives of the various factions of the crusade gathered. It was, in terms of the concentration of power in one place, one of the most significant gatherings in human history. The structure of the council, at least as it is presented in the law, was a formal debate. Those who opposed psychic use in the legions would make their case. Those who supported it would make theirs. The emperor would listen and deliver judgment. In practice, several layers of theatre were operating simultaneously. On the surface, the most aggressive voices against psychic practice were familiar ones. Mortarion of the Death Guard stood and testified about the nature of psychic power from personal experience, about the worlds he had seen ruined by individuals who wielded abilities they didn't understand, about the way the Age of Strife had been an extended demonstration of what happened when humanity developed psychic capacity without the wisdom to manage it. His testimony was personal and emotionally visceral and difficult to simply argue away, because Mortarion had lived through something real and was speaking from it. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves was there, and his position was simpler and more direct. He believed the Thousand Sons were sorcerers. He believed sorcery was wrong. He wanted it stopped. On Bon's seat, the other side, Magnus made the case for psychic practice with the full force of his extraordinary mind. He gave an extended argument in the form of an allegory, drawing on what might have been Plato's cave as a philosophical framework, arguing that ignorance of the warp's true nature was more dangerous than understanding it, that the fear of knowledge was itself the greatest threat, that disciplined and informed engagement with psychic reality was the only rational response to a universe that contained it, whether anyone wanted it to or not. It was, by most accounts in the law, a genuinely impressive performance. He moved the debate. He shifted opinions. He made the case in a way that left the opposition scrambling for counterarguments. And none of it made any difference, because the verdict was already decided. This is one of those places in 40,000 law where you have to look at what the emperor actually did, rather than what he said, or how the event was framed publicly, to understand what was really happening. The emperor had summoned Leman Russ to Nicaea in secret. 3 great companies of space wolves were present, concealed from psychic detection by a retinue of Sisters of Silence, the blank gene-bearing warriors whose psychic nullity made them invisible to anyone relying on warp sense to map their surroundings. Leman Russ, Primarch of the 6th Legion, was hidden in the audience at a council ostensibly about debate and open deliberation. The reasoning that the law suggests is that the emperor anticipated Magnus might react badly to an unfavorable verdict, might lose his temper, might do something that would require a forceful response. Read this carefully. The emperor had brought his most militarily aggressive, most battle-capable, most instinctively violent Primarch to a council meeting and hidden him specifically as a contingency against one particular outcome. He had hidden Russ from Magnus psychically. He had positioned the most lethal hunter in the room, so that the most psychically powerful person in the room wouldn't know he was there until it was too late. This is an extraordinary thing to do to someone you trust. This is the kind of measure you take when you are genuinely uncertain about how someone will react, when the worst-case scenario you are planning for is one where that person's power becomes a threat you need to immediately contain. The emperor feared what Magnus might do, not because Magnus was evil. Magnus at this point was still completely loyal. He had done nothing to suggest he would turn traitor or become an active threat to the Imperium. But his power was in a domain the emperor couldn't fully control, and his personality was one that didn't respond well to being told he was wrong.
Honestly, Magnus is the Primarch I keep coming back to, not because he's the most powerful and not because his design is incredible, though it is, but because his story genuinely bothers me in a way most 40k lore doesn't. He did everything right by his own logic. He warned his father, he tried to save his sons, he accepted his punishment, and none of it mattered. That's the kind of tragedy that sticks with you. I don't think Magnus did nothing wrong, but I do think he was failed just as much as he failed others, and I find that a lot more interesting than a straightforward villain. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
And the Emperor, who was playing a game that operated across a longer timescale and a wider scope than any of his sons could perceive, needed to be sure that if he delivered a verdict that Magnus didn't want to hear, Magnus couldn't, immediately and catastrophically respond to it. The verdict itself, when the Emperor delivered it, was exactly what Russ and Mortarion had wanted. Sorcery was banned. The Librarius programs were disbanded. Psychers within the legions were to be restricted to the narrow functional categories of astropaths and navigators, the kinds of psychic use that were operationally necessary and couldn't practically be eliminated without crippling the Empire's infrastructure. Magnus's vision of the Thousand Suns as a legitimate and valuable psychic fighting force was officially declared over. The Emperor's closing speech, in the version of events preserved in the lore, was a meditation on the dangers of arrogance in the pursuit of power and knowledge. It might as well have been addressed directly to Magnus. It described, with considerable precision, the kind of hubris that Magnus had been demonstrating, the belief that superior intelligence and careful discipline were sufficient protection against dangers that did not respond to intelligence or discipline. Magnus accepted the verdict. He was not happy about it. The law is quite clear that he found it deeply unjust, that he believed the Emperor had made an error, that he spent the journey home processing a degree of anger that he didn't fully let himself express. But he accepted it formally. He said he would comply. Then he went home to Prospero and continued his research in secret. This is one of those moments where it's almost impossible to read Magnus's choices uncharitably. He had been told by his father that the thing he had dedicated his life to was illegal. The arguments against it were, in his judgment, wrong, driven by fear and misunderstanding, rather than by accurate assessment of the actual risks. The verdict had been delivered after a theatrical debate that was, as far as he could tell, rigged from the beginning. And the thing he was supposed to stop doing was genuinely important, genuinely valuable, and one of the only tools he had for protecting his legion and serving the Emperor's project effectively. He kept studying the warp because he believed stopping would be wrong. He kept doing what he thought was right, because the authority telling him it was wrong had, in his judgment, made a mistake. This is not unusual behavior for a highly intelligent, highly principled person who disagrees with a rule and believes they understand the underlying situation better than the rule makers do. It is, however, extraordinarily dangerous when the person doing it is in a position where the consequences of their independent judgment can affect the entire galaxy, and when the thing they're continuing to do in secret, the deep probing of a psychic realm filled with entities that specifically want to manipulate and corrupt the most gifted and ambitious humans they can find, is exactly the thing their father feared most. Section 6. The Secret Project. Why Magnus was the variable. To understand why Magnus's choices hit as hard as they did, you need to understand what the Emperor was actually doing when he stopped leading the Great Crusade in person and returned to Terra. Most of the Primarchs knew that their father had returned to the Imperial Palace and was working on something. He left overall command of the crusade to Horus, which created its own tensions. But the public story was that the Emperor had moved from direct military leadership to administrative oversight, managing the political infrastructure of an empire that was growing faster than any government apparatus could easily track. This was partially true. The administrative challenge was real and enormous, but it wasn't the real reason. The real reason was the Webway project. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in a complex of tunnels and chambers that became known as the Imperial Dungeon, the Emperor had been working on something that he had, to be absolutely certain about this, told precisely no one about. Not Malkador, who was his oldest and closest advisor and had served as his right hand for millennia. Not any of the Primarchs, not the highest levels of the Mechanicum. Nobody. What he was building was a human entrance to the Elder Webway. The Webway is one of those concepts in 40,000 that genuinely rewards careful attention. It is a network of tunnels, corridors, and passageways that exist between real space and the warp, threaded through the fabric of reality in a way that makes them accessible from most locations in the galaxy without actually passing through the warp itself. The Eldar built it during their species' height, using technologies and psychic techniques that humans of the 41st millennium have entirely lost the ability to replicate. And for an interstellar civilization, it was transformative. Moving through the Webway was faster than warp travel, safer than warp travel, and didn't expose travelers to the psychic predations of entities that lived in the warp and found humans delicious. The Emperor had found an ancient device, something dating back perhaps to the Dark Age of technology, or even before, installed in ruins beneath Asia. This device, which would eventually become the Golden Throne, was capable of being used by a sufficiently powerful psyker to project a psychic sheath into the Webway, protecting a corridor of tunnels from warp incursion and making them habitable and traversable for humans. The Emperor had spent enormous effort refurbishing and expanding this device, and had put armies of Mechanicum workers to the task of literally constructing new Webway tunnels from materials that weren't naturally psychically resistant, relying on his projected power to keep them safe from whatever lived in the spaces between. The goal of this project was nothing less than the liberation of humanity from dependence on the warp. Think about what that means. Every interstellar voyage the Imperium makes goes through the warp. Every warp voyage requires navigators, whose genetic mutation allows them to plot safe courses through that dimension. Every communication across interstellar distances requires astropaths, whose psychic transmissions are filtered through the warp. The entire infrastructure of the Imperium rests on a foundation of controlled exposure to the most dangerous and predatory psychic environment in the known universe. The navigators know this, which is why they maintain a monopoly on their abilities so jealously. The astropaths know this, which is why being soul-bound to the Emperor is the price of their service. The Chaos Gods know this too, which is why the warp is so convenient for their designs. If the Emperor's Webway project succeeded, all of that changed. Humanity could traverse the galaxy without passing through the realm where its greatest enemies lived. The Chaos Gods would lose their primary vector for influence. The Navigator's monopoly would become obsolete. Psychic dependency for interstellar travel would end. And most importantly, the gradual grinding corruption that the warp exerted on every human who had to deal with it, whether or not they were a psyker, would be broken. Humanity would have an escape route from the warp's gravity well. The Emperor considered this, depending on which part of the lore you're reading, possibly the most important project in human history. More important than the Great Crusade. More important than the legions. More important than any political or military achievement, because it addressed the root cause of humanity's vulnerability rather than fighting its symptoms. And here is where Magnus becomes the critical variable, the factor that makes this story specifically his story, rather than the story of any other Primarch. The device that had become the Golden Throne required an extraordinarily powerful psyker to operate it. Not just skilled, not just trained. The kind of power required was, in practical terms, Primarch level. Specifically, Psyker Primarch Level A category with an extremely small membership. The evidence in the lore, spread across multiple sources, suggests strongly that the Emperor intended Magnus to eventually take his place on that device, to be the mind that projected the psychic sheath into the Webway, freeing the Emperor to pursue other things, to be the anchor point for humanity's liberation from warp dependency. Malcador, who eventually had to take the Golden Throne when the Emperor left to face Horus, was one of the 2 or 3 most powerful human psychers in history. He lasted a matter of hours before the strain of the task effectively killed him. leaving nothing but dust by the time the Emperor returned. The human body and mind, even at Malcador's extraordinary level, was not built to sustain the kind of psychic projection the device demanded. But Magnus could have sustained it. Magnus was the only being other than the Emperor himself who, by psychic capability alone, had any realistic chance of operating the Golden Throne without it destroying him. And the Emperor knew this. The Emperor had, according to the law's strong implication, planned this. This tells you something crucial about how the Emperor saw Magnus, not just as a son, not just as a legion commander, as a necessary element in the most important technical and strategic project of the entire age, as the person who would, eventually, free the Emperor from the one task that required his personal presence and allow humanity to take the final step in its liberation from the warp. The Emperor needed Magnus like he needed no other Primarch. Magnus was irreplaceable in this plan in a way that Horus wasn't, and Guilliman wasn't, and even Sanguinius, for all his beauty and his foresight and his sacrifice, wasn't. And Magnus was out there getting deeper and deeper into sorcery that the Emperor didn't fully control, building relationships with forces in the warp that the Emperor hadn't sanctioned, accumulating knowledge and power that followed its own trajectory rather than the one the Emperor had planned, and generally being a person who made genuinely independent decisions rather than one who simply executed his father's intentions. The fear the Emperor felt around Magnus was not the fear of an enemy. It was something more complicated. It was the fear of a person who desperately needed something and was watching it walk toward the edge of a cliff. It was the fear of someone who had made elaborate plans around a variable that kept declining to be predictable, and then that variable did something that the Emperor couldn't have fully predicted, though Tzeentch almost certainly could, because Tzeentch had been arranging things with exactly this outcome in mind. Magnus picked up everything he had seen in the warp, all the depth of his knowledge and the full force of his extraordinary psychic power, and he used them to save the Imperium. He used them to try to warn his father about Horus, and he destroyed everything. Section 7. Magnus's Folly, the warning that broke the galaxy. Magnus was on Prospero when it happened. He had returned there after Nicaea, ostensibly to comply with the edict against sorcerous practice and guide his legion through the transition, in reality, to continue his research under the cover of compliance. He had built around Prospero a psychic observatory of extraordinary sensitivity, a framework of wards and listening posts, and warp-facing instruments that let him observe events across vast distances with a clarity that no astropathic network could match. And from this observatory, he watched Horus die. Or rather, he watched Horus undergo the transformation that was, functionally, the death of who Horus had been, and the birth of something that wore Horus's face for the Chaos God's purposes. He watched it happen on Davin, at the moon called Davin's Lung, where the corrupted word-bearers, First Chaplain Erebus, arranged for Horus to be exposed to a warp corruption that combined with a mortal wound he had received in battle, began the process of pulling the War Master toward chaos. Magnus watched the ritual. He watched the corruption take hold. He watched his brother, whom he had genuinely respected and been fond of, begin to become something else. He tried to intervene directly, projecting his consciousness into the ritual space to reach Horus's mind and pull him back. He failed. The corruption was too advanced, or the forces protecting it too powerful, or simply the choice that some part of Horus made in that moment was beyond Magnus's ability to reverse. He knew what this meant. If Horus fell, the entire Great Crusade fell with him. Everything the Emperor had built, everything Magnus had devoted himself to, would be torn apart by a civil war in which one side was led by the War Master of mankind, the being given authority over every legion that was not personally commanded by a Primarch, the being who had more influence over more Space Marine forces than anyone other than the Emperor himself. Magnus had to warn his father. The Emperor was working in the Imperial dungeon, in the deepest parts of the palace, focused entirely on the Webway project. Normal communication channels would take too long. Astropathic transmission across that distance, getting a message from Prospero to Terra, would require days at minimum and might not arrive with the urgency or clarity the situation demanded. Horus's betrayal was already beginning. The word-bearers were already seeding corruption through the legions. Every day that the Emperor didn't know was another day the heresy solidified its foundations. Magnus made a decision. He reached for the most powerful psychic technique in his arsenal, a form of astral projection that would let him send his consciousness across the galaxy at the speed of thought rather than the speed of light, or even the speed of warp travel. He would go to Terra. He would go to the Emperor. He would deliver the warning, personally. He began to gather the power for this working, and as he did, in the dark spaces between intention and execution, a voice offered him more, just a little more, enough to push through cleanly, to make the transmission perfect rather than distorted by the distances involved. Magnus, focused on the urgency of what he was doing, accepted without asking too many questions about where the extra power came from. Tzeentch had been waiting for exactly this moment. Magnus's consciousness blazed across the galaxy, and as it moved through the warp on its way to Terra, it passed through a corridor, a tunnel of psychically shielded architecture that was precisely the human-built webway extension that thousands of Mechanicum workers had been constructing under the Emperor's protection for years. The psychic wards on that corridor were extraordinarily delicate, calibrated by the Emperor himself to keep the warp out of a tunnel that had been built from materials that weren't naturally resistant to warp intrusion. The wards needed the Emperor's personal power to maintain. Magnus, in the full force of his psychic transit, hit those wards like a battering ram. The extra power that the anonymous warp voice had given him, Tzeentch's contribution to the working, ensured that the breach wasn't a small one. The wards didn't crack or strain or partially hold. They shattered. Multiple holes opened in the psychic shielding of the Imperial webway, and through those holes poured exactly the kind of things the shielding was meant to keep out. Demons. Warp entities. The servants of chaos, given a direct route through the webway tunnels to the doorways that led into the Imperial Palace itself. The Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence who were stationed in the webway suddenly found themselves in a desperate defense against an overwhelming incursion. Thousands of Mechanicum workers, who had been peacefully constructing the Emperor's great work, died in waves as things they had no doctrine for and no equipment against, swarmed through the ruptured corridors. The carefully constructed tunnels that had been years in the making became killing grounds. And the Emperor, upon whom the entire psychic structure depended, was forced to sit down at the Golden Throne and stay there. Because the only thing preventing the daemonic flood from erupting through the portal beneath the palace and into the real world above was the Emperor's psychic power projected through the device, holding the breach closed with the full force of his will. From that moment on, the Emperor was a prisoner of his own project. He could leave briefly, with enormous effort and at enormous cost, but for practical purposes, the being who had been intending to guide and oversee the most important war in human history had to remain seated in a dungeon under his palace, holding the line against a demonic incursion, unable to devote his full attention to anything else. Magnus had arrived at the Emperor's psychic presence moments after the breach occurred. He delivered his warning. He told the Emperor about Horus. He told him everything he had seen, everything he knew, everything he had concluded about the trajectory of the gathering heresy. The Emperor refused to believe him, or more precisely, and this is a more complex and devastating reading of what happened, the Emperor was so furious about what Magnus's arrival had done to the Webway project that he was psychologically unable to process the warning on its merits. His great work, his most important project, the thing that was supposed to be his final gift to humanity, was ruined. Decades of labor, the deaths of thousands of workers, the loss of what might have been humanity's best chance to escape warp dependency. All of it, in an instant, because Magnus had used sorcery in violation of the Nicaea edicts, had plunged his psychic presence through the wards that were keeping the Webway safe, had ignored every prohibition and every caution, and had done exactly the kind of thing that the Emperor had been afraid he would do. The Emperor's response to Magnus's warning about Horus was, essentially, not to believe him, or at least, not to act as if he did. He concluded, in some mixture of genuine misread and emotional catastrophizing, that it was Magnus who had gone wrong, not Horus. Horus, whom he loved beyond almost anything. Horus, whom he had elevated above all his other sons. Horus could not have done this. Magnus had. This interpretation is almost certainly not the Emperor's sincere logical conclusion about who was responsible for what. The Emperor was too intelligent for that, and at some level, he almost certainly knew the truth of what Magnus was telling him. But the Horus heresy law has always operated in the interesting space where the Emperor's emotional commitments were capable of temporarily overriding his analytical faculties. And in that moment, the person he needed to punish was Magnus. He chose to believe that his perfect plan had been sabotaged rather than that his favorite son had betrayed him. He dispatched Leman Russ to bring Magnus to Terra. The order was to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment, not to destroy the 1,000 Suns, not to scour Prospero, to bring Magnus in chains, alive, to face the Emperor's verdict for violating the Nicaea edicts. Capture, not execution. Horus intercepted Russ on the way to Prospero. This is the other move in Sench's game, though Horus was fully capable of independent treachery without divine assistance. Horus was already planning the heresy in detail at this point. Magnus was, he knew, one of the most powerful loyalist Primarchs. More than that, Magnus had just proven that he was capable of seeing things Horus was trying to hide. A loyal Magnus, brought to Terra and given a chance to explain what he had seen on Davin, might convince the Emperor of what was actually happening in time for the Emperor to act on it. Magnus was a threat to the heresy's success. So Horus sent a message to Russ. He told Russ that the Emperor had changed his mind, that the Emperor wanted Prospero destroyed and Magnus dead, not captured, that the order of execution superseded the order of arrest. This was a lie. But Horus carried the Emperor's authority as War Master, and Russ had no way to independently verify the message. More than that, Russ wanted to believe it. He already thought Magnus was dangerous. He already thought the 1,000 Suns were an infection in the body of the Imperium. The permission he needed to do the thing he had wanted to do for years had just arrived, in the form of an order he had every formal reason to trust. Russ turned his fleet toward Prospero, and he stopped trying to find a way to communicate with Magnus to negotiate a surrender. He was going to execute an extinction. Section 8, the burning of Prospero. Fire, ash, and a broken back. Magnus knew they were coming. Of course he knew. He was the most powerful, psychic entity in the galaxy, short of the Emperor himself, ruling from the world he had built into an observatory of warp sight. He perceived the Space Wolves fleet moving toward Prospero with plenty of time to prepare. He had time to evacuate the civilians. He had time to organize a defense. He had time to call for help, perhaps to reach out to other loyalist forces and make the case that what was happening was not what it appeared to be. He did none of these things. He put up a psychic veil over Prospero instead. Not a defense against the incoming fleet. A veil that prevented his own psychic adepts, his own Corvidae librarians, whose specialty was divination and foreknowledge, from perceiving what was coming. He deliberately blinded his own legion to their approaching destruction. There is a strand of interpretation in the law that finds this incomprehensible, that reads it as Magnus simply shutting down psychologically after the magnitude of what he had done to the webway became clear to him. And there may be truth to that. Magnus had, by this point, had time to process what had happened. He had tried to do the right thing, and in doing it, had destroyed something irreplaceable. He had been used by Tzeentch as a tool for catastrophe, while believing he was acting freely. He had warned his father about Horus, and his father had not listened, had instead decided that Magnus was the traitor. The weight of all of this hitting a person of Magnus's depth of feeling and intellectual self-awareness simultaneously would be genuinely overwhelming. But there is another interpretation. and it is the one the law seems to prefer. Magnus had decided to accept his punishment. He had concluded that the only way to preserve any honor, any meaning, any dignity in what had happened was to take the consequences of his actions without resistance. If the Emperor had decided Magnus deserved to die for what he had done to the webway, then Magnus would die. He would not fight back. He would not try to avoid it. He would bear witness to the justice being done, even though in his heart he knew it was unjust, because the alternative, resisting and thereby confirming the narrative that he was a threat that needed to be put down by force, was worse. He was, in his own way, trying to do the right thing, again. Ahriman disagreed. The chief librarian, first captain of the Thousand Sons, the man who had been Magnus's closest lieutenant for decades, refused to simply stand still and die. He organized a defense. He rallied the legion. He positioned his warriors and the legion's vast psychic power to resist what was coming, not to win a battle against the most aggressive legion in the Imperium, backed by the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, but to make the defense honorable, to ensure that whatever happened to Prospero, the Thousand Sons died as warriors rather than as passive victims. The Space Wolves came with everything they had. More than 70,000 Space Marines, from Russ's Legion alone, accompanied by detachments of Custodes and large numbers of Sisters of Silence, whose psychic nullity was specifically chosen as a counter to a legion of Psykers. Orbital strikes preceded the landing, targeting Prospero's defensive batteries and reducing the planet's ability to respond to the incoming assault from orbit. When the Wolves landed, they came in waves, pushing through the outer defensive lines, advancing through the great cities and academies and libraries that Magnus had spent decades building. The libraries burned. This was perhaps the most deliberately cruel element of the assault, or at least the element that Magnus found most devastating. The Space Wolves' rune priest Othera Weirdmake specifically led teams into the Pyramid of the Corvidae, the great repository of the Thousand Sons' accumulated knowledge, and began systematically destroying everything within it. Texts that had been gathered from across the galaxy, records of knowledge and history and the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that would never produce another copy, burned. The greatest library in the Imperium outside of Terra itself, reduced to ash. For a long time, Magnus watched from his tower. He let Ahriman direct the defense. He stood and watched his world die and waited for the inevitable end. Then he stopped waiting. He came down from his tower in the final phase of the battle, when barely 1,500,000 suns remained alive, when Ahriman had pulled the last defenders back to the final perimeter before the Pyramid of Photep. He came down, and the sky above Prospero tore open. He reached into the warp and pulled its energies into reality with a force that reshaped the battlefield, turning the moat around the pyramid to boiling acid with a gesture, sending shadowy hands up from pools of water to drag enemies under. It was not the restrained, disciplined use of psychic power that the Thousand Sons had always advocated. It was grief and rage, channeled through the most powerful natural psychic talent in the galaxy, and it was terrifying. Leman Russ met him in the middle of it. Their duel is one of the most significant personal combats in all of 40k's history. Not because of the tactical implications, though those were real enough, because of what it represented. Two Primarchs who had hated each other for decades, who had been building toward this moment through a series of misunderstandings and genuine disagreements and political manipulations, none of which they had fully controlled, finally, without any more barriers between them. Just two brothers on a ruined causeway, while their legions died around them. Magnus hit Russ with fists wreathed in fire and lightning. He drove one massive blow into Russ's chestplate, hard enough to shatter ceramite and drive fragments into the flesh beneath. Russ grabbed the arm that had struck him and broke it. Magnus drove a blade of pure psychic force through Russ's body in response. They staggered. They kept fighting. In the end, Magnus was hurt worse. He called on regenerative techniques to heal his arm and his empty eye socket, and Russ grabbed him while he was focused on that internal work, lifted him high above the ruined ground below them, and broke his back across his knee. The sound of Magnus's spine snapping carried across the entire battlefield. His own warriors heard it and felt it like a gunshot to the soul. As Russ raised his frostblade Mjolnir for the finishing blow, Magnus did the last thing no one expected. He reached out with his mind to Ahriman, who had been preparing a working that Magnus himself had helped design long before this day, a working whose purpose was precisely this moment. He used Ahriman as the anchor for a massive teleportation ritual. He poured everything he had left into it. Magnus vanished. Every surviving thousand sun on the surface of Prospero vanished with him. Fewer than 1,500 warriors transported through the warp to a world that awaited them deep inside the Eye of Terror. The planet of sorcerers, Sortiarius, the world that Sanch had been preparing for this moment. Russ's blade came down on empty ground. Magnus had saved his sons. He had done the one thing that even then, even in the ruin of everything, was still in his power to do. He had not saved them well. He had not saved Prospero, or its libraries, or its millions of ordinary citizens, many of whom had been killed in the assault, or left behind to whatever fate awaited a world whose legion had fled. He had not saved the 1,000 sons from what was coming next, but he had kept them alive, and in the moment, that was the only currency left. His final words to Leman Russ, carried back through the warp as he disappeared, were this: "You are a sword in the wrong hands, my brother." It was true, and Russ, probably, knew it. Section 9, The Shattering, Soul Shards, the Rubric, and Ascension. When Magnus arrived on the planet of sorcerers, he was not entirely himself. The physical trauma of Russ's final blow, combined with the enormous psychic expenditure of the teleportation working, had done something to him that went beyond simple injury. His soul had fractured. The being that had been Magnus the Red, the unified consciousness that had held together across decades of psychic development and hardship, had shattered into pieces during that final working, leaving multiple distinct fragments that operated independently of each other, each carrying different aspects of Magnus's personality and history and power. This is one of those lore elements that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On a practical level, it explains certain narrative inconsistencies, why the Magnus who appears on the planet of sorcerers in one story seems fundamentally different from the one who appears elsewhere. On a thematic level, it is almost inescapably meaningful. Magnus, the person who had always prided himself on unity of understanding, on seeing the whole picture when others saw only fragments, had become literally fragmented. The wholeness he had sought his entire life, the integration of knowledge and power and identity, had been broken apart at the moment of his greatest defeat. The known shards include the Crimson King, the primary shard that took up residence on the planet of sorcerers and constituted what most people thought of as Magnus in the immediate aftermath of Prospero. There was a shard of Prospero, a fragment representing the grief and anger of that loss, a shard embodying warrior aspects, a shard representing the questing part of Magnus's nature, his drive to discover and understand, and one shard, the one that the lore treats as perhaps the most important and the most tragic, represented Magnus's nobility, his goodness, the genuine ethical core that had made him, despite everything, a being who kept trying to do the right thing. That fifth shard was located on Terra. Ahriman would eventually track down 4 of the 5 shards and reintegrate them with the primary Magnus, restoring the demon Primarch to something approaching his original coherence. But the 5th shard, the nobility shard, was never recovered in any conventional sense. It found its way to a different fate, one that has interesting implications for other parts of the Warhammer lore. But let's stay with the planet of sorcerers, because what happened there next deserves its own full examination. The 1,000 Sons had survived Prospero, but they had survived in terrible condition. They were in the Eye of Terror, in a region of space where the warp bleeds into reality and the normal rules of physics are more suggestions than laws. And being in that environment, being in close contact with the demonic currents that flowed through that region, did to the Thousand Suns what it does to everything that isn't armored against it by genuine psychic strength. The flesh change returned. The mutations that Magnus had spent his eye bargaining away for a temporary reprieve, the same genetic defect that had threatened to destroy the Legion before the Great Crusade even began, came back with the vicious momentum of something that had been suppressed too long. Men began to change, not slowly and subtly, but rapidly and catastrophically. The floor of Sortiarius was littered with the evidence of what the warp did to soldiers who carried a psychic mutation and were immersed in a psychic environment without adequate protection. The pride of the Thousand Suns, the scholars and philosophers and sorcerers who had survived Prospero, were dissolving into something they would not have recognized as themselves. Magnus seemed to accept this, whether from despair or from some calculation that Tzeentch, the god of change, would simply countermand any effort to stop mutation among a legion that now served him. Magnus did not act with the urgency the situation demanded. He withdrew into his tower. He looked out from the planet of sorcerers through the eye of terror and toward the galaxy that had become his enemy. Ahriman could not accept it. Arzek Ahriman had been the Thousand Suns' chief librarian for as long as the Legion had been at full operational capacity. He had been Magnus's closest confidant, the person most responsible for translating Magnus's vision into practical guidance for the Legion, the commander who had made Prospero's last stand possible at all. He had watched his twin brother die to the flesh change before the Legion ever reached Prospero. He had devoted decades to understanding the condition and searching for a cure, and the horror of watching it return in the eye of terror after everything they had already been through was, for Ahriman, simply unbearable. He went to the Book of Magnus. The Book of Magnus was still with the Legion, the great compendium of sorcerous knowledge that the Crimson King had compiled across decades of study. Ahriman delved into it with the specific intention of finding something that could stop the flesh change permanently, not as a temporary suppression, but as a complete elimination of the condition. He gathered a cabal of the Legion's most powerful remaining sorcerers. He developed the ritual, drawing from the book's most advanced and dangerous formulae, and he executed it without first receiving Magnus's permission because he was afraid Magnus would refuse. The sky over the planet of sorcerers erupted in storms of blue and yellow lightning. The bolts came down on every Thousand Suns warrior across the entire planet simultaneously. The working was of an unprecedented scale, consuming psychic energy at a rate that registered as a disturbance detectable across enormous distances. The flesh change was stopped, and every Thousand Sun without meaningful psychic power had their body turned to dust. The joints of their armor were welded shut by the infernal fire of the ritual. Their physical bodies, every muscle and bone and organ, were reduced to ash that rattled inside the hermetically sealed metal. But their souls did not depart. Their consciousness, such as it remained, was trapped inside the power armor that had been their protection in life and had now become their prison. They could move, driven by the sorcerous energy now animating their suits. They could follow instructions from nearby psychers who could direct them through sheer force of will. They could fight, but they could not think independently. They could not speak, or reason, or feel, or remember. They were hollow walking suits of armor powered by the imprisoned remnants of what had once been people, the Rubric Marines. Magnus came down from his tower. He looked at what had been done to his legion by the ritual that used his own book, his own accumulated knowledge, as its foundation. He looked at the animated automatons that had been his scholars, his companions, the sons he had always tried to protect, now reduced to spectral puppets. He fought Ahriman, who had not the slightest chance against a Primarch, and was struck down by Magnus's fury. He raised his fist to kill Ahriman, and then a voice spoke from the warp. Tzeentch, just as planned. The voice reminded Magnus that Ahriman and his cabal were Tzeentch's pawns now, as Magnus himself was, that destroying them would be destroying assets that served the Changer of Ways, that everything that had happened, from the flesh changes return to the rubric's casting, to the specific catastrophic form it had taken, was all part of a plan that Magnus hadn't understood until this moment. Magnus let Ahriman live. He banished him from the planet of sorcerers, exiling him to wander the galaxy, which is where the remarkable series of Ahriman novels picks up the story. And Magnus went back to his tower. He did not give himself to Tzeentch fully until later, until a battle against Vulcan during the Siege of Terra nearly cost him his life, a moment where the choice came down to extinction or transformation, and he chose transformation. The demon Primarch emerged from that crucible, winged and cloven-hooved, the red copper of his skin now something deeper and more disturbing, his one remaining eye burning with psychic fire that had no warm light in it anymore. He had become what Tzeentch had been carefully building toward from the moment a warp entity offered him a bargain for his legion's health on Prospero. And from that point forward, Magnus the Red, who had spent his entire life trying to understand the warp in order to serve humanity, served instead as the champion of the god who had been manipulating him from the beginning. Expanded section, The Thousand Suns at War, a deeper look. There is something worth dwelling on about the way the Thousand Suns actually operated during the Great Crusade, because it illuminates not just their tactics, but the philosophical commitments that made them who they were, and that eventually made their eventual fate feel like such a specific kind of cruelty. When Magnus led his legion into compliance operations, the initial phase almost always began with knowledge gathering rather than combat deployment. The Corvidae, one of the 5 fellowship cults within the Legion, were specialists in divination and precognitive ability. Before a single bolt was fired on a new world, Corvidae adepts were already reading the psychic currents that surrounded it, mapping the shape of events that had not yet happened, identifying the leverage points where minimal force would produce maximum compliance. This was not clairvoyance in the simple popular sense. It was a disciplined technique that required years of training and operated within strict protocols designed to prevent the kind of psychic feedback that unguided precognition could produce. The other cults had their own specializations. The Athenian were masters of telepathy, minds that could reach into enemy commanders and read their intentions with enough accuracy to shape the battle before it began. The Pavoni were practitioners of biomancy, the psychic manipulation of living tissue, capable of healing wounds that would be fatal by any conventional medical standard, or, in combat, of turning those same abilities to offensive purposes that were not pleasant to witness. The Raptora specialized in telekinesis, the movement and shaping of physical matter through psychic will, which translated on the battlefield to soldiers who could stop incoming fire in mid-air, collapse structures on enemy positions, or project barriers of compressed force that deflected even heavy weapons. The Pyrae were the ones most visible in combat, channeling psychic fire, but within the Legion they were also associated with transformation and purification, with the idea that destruction by fire cleared the ground for something new. Each of these disciplines was studied with the rigor of an academic subject. The Thousand Suns kept records of their training and their development in the same way a university would keep records of scholarly progress. Promotion within the Legion was based partly on martial achievement, but also, and unusually, on demonstrated intellectual growth, on the depth of understanding a warrior had developed about the nature of his abilities, on his ability to articulate and teach what he knew rather than simply do it. There were debates about the best approach to practically any combat situation, conducted in the Legion's mess halls and strategy rooms, debates that were sometimes more intellectually rigorous than those that happened in the academies of Prospero itself. This was a Legion that genuinely cared about understanding what it was doing and why, and which believed that understanding made you more effective rather than less. The tragedies of this culture, when they came, cut in specific ways. When the libraries burned, it wasn't just buildings being destroyed. It was decades of intellectual work, of carefully annotated research and developed understanding and slowly accumulated insight, going up in smoke at the hands of warriors whose approach to knowledge was fundamentally different. The Space Wolves valued the knowledge of how to fight, encoded in tradition and song and physical practice. They had no particular relationship with written scholarship as a form of accumulated wisdom. The texts they burned were not, in their framework, irreplaceable. Everything important had been remembered, hadn't it? You didn't need a library to know how to honor your dead or how to protect your people. The Thousand Sons experienced the burning of their libraries as a kind of death that went beyond the deaths of warriors, which were honorable and expected in war. The death of knowledge was something else, something that the warriors of the 6th Legion weren't equipped to understand as a form of atrocity, because for them, it simply wasn't one. And there is something specifically heartbreaking about the fact that the great corpus of knowledge that Magnus compiled, the Book of Magnus, the extraordinary document that represented his life's work in understanding the warp, eventually became the instrument of his legion's final transformation. Ahriman used it. Ahriman drew from its formulae and incantations and built the rubric from the foundation of what Magnus had created out of love and curiosity and the drive to protect his sons. Magnus's greatest intellectual achievement became the mechanism by which the last people he had dedicated that achievement to protecting were turned into hollow metal shells. It is, in the precise sense of the word, poetic. But it is the kind of poetry that hurts. Expanded section. The Emperor's psychology. What secrets cost. There is something uncomfortable at the heart of the Emperor's handling of the whole situation with Magnus that becomes more visible the more carefully you examine it. And it is this. The Emperor kept too many secrets from too many people for too long, and the Charmar secrets cost him everything. The Webway project was secret because of practical concerns about the navigators and their reaction to having their monopoly threatened. This is, as a reason for secrecy, actually reasonable. The Navi's Nobilite wielded enormous political power, and a premature revelation that the Emperor was building an alternative to warp travel could have created exactly the kind of political destabilization that would have made the project impossible to complete before it was ready. The Emperor was not wrong to keep it secret, but the secrecy meant that Magnus, when he blazed his psychic warning across the galaxy, had no idea what he was hitting. He knew there were psychic wards on the Imperial Palace, protections that the Emperor had put in place. He knew he was pushing through something. He did not know, could not have known, that on the other side of those wards were not just security systems, but an active living construction zone full of human workers and the critical infrastructure of the Emperor's most important project. If he had known, there is every reason to believe he would have found a different way to deliver his warning. Not because he would have respected the Nicaea edicts, clearly he didn't, and clearly he was going to do what he thought was necessary regardless, but because he genuinely didn't want to destroy something the Emperor had built. He was trying to protect the Emperor's project, not sabotage it. The secrecy, in other words, directly caused the catastrophe. There is a version of this where the Emperor tells Magnus about the Webway project, where he says to his most psychically gifted son, "Look, I am building something remarkable, and here is what it is, and here is why it has to stay secret from the navigators for now. But I need you to know that the psychic architecture beneath the palace is more delicate than it appears." In that version, Magnus either finds a different way to warn the Emperor about Horus, or he approaches the warning with enough care to avoid the catastrophic breach. The Emperor chose not to have that conversation. He chose not to trust Magnus with the information. Whether this was because he genuinely didn't think Magnus needed to know, or because he was already in a posture of suspicion about Magnus that made sharing sensitive information with him feel risky, or because the secrecy had become such a habit that sharing it with anyone, even the most necessary ally, felt like a violation of something essential. The law doesn't give us a clean answer. But the result is that the Emperor created the conditions for his own undoing by refusing to trust the person he most needed to trust. There is something almost Tzeentchian about this irony. The Changer of Ways, whose entire game is built around information, around knowing more than the other players know and using information asymmetry as a weapon, exploited a situation where the Emperor, of all people, had created his own information gap. The most intelligent being in the galaxy had decided that a specific piece of information was too sensitive to share with the one person whose actions it most needed to constrain. And Tzeentch had seen that, and planned around it, and waited for the moment when the information gap would produce exactly the catastrophe he needed. The Horus Heresy is often read as a story about Horus's corruption and betrayal. It is also a story about the Emperor's failures of trust, which are if anything more interesting because they come from a being whose intelligence and planning capability should have been more than adequate to avoid them. The Emperor made mistakes not because he was stupid, but because intelligence alone is not sufficient protection against the specific vulnerabilities of loving too much, trusting too little, and keeping secrets that were meant to protect, but ended up enabling the very disasters they were designed to prevent. Magnus loved the Emperor. The Emperor needed Magnus and feared what Magnus might become. Neither of these things was in itself wrong. The failure was in letting those feelings determine behavior rather than honest assessment and open communication. It is, at its core, a family tragedy. And like most family tragedies, the damage it produces is out of all proportion to the mistakes that caused it. Expanded section. What the Rubric Marines mean. It would be possible to spend this entire video on the Rubric Marines and the philosophical weight they carry in the setting. So let's take a moment to sit with them properly, because they are one of those 40k elements that rewards being taken seriously rather than just appreciated as a distinctive aesthetic. Every Rubric Marine was a person. It sounds almost too obvious to say, but it is worth saying slowly and with deliberate attention. Each one of those animated suits of armor, encasing dust and trapped consciousness, was at some point a man who came from somewhere, who had trained for decades to become a warrior, who had their own thoughts and relationships and memories and small personal histories that will never be recovered and will never be known. The flesh change was coming for them, and the alternative Ahriman offered was sold to itself as salvation. Instead, it was something harder to categorize than either life or death. Are the Rubric Marines alive? By most standards of the question, no. Their physical bodies are gone. Their ability to think independently is gone. They cannot initiate action of their own volition. Without a sorcerer to animate and direct them, they stand inert, empty-looking suits of ancient power armor from which, if you were close enough and the environment was quiet enough, you might hear a sound like wind through hollow space. But they are not dead in the conventional sense either. The souls are there. The lore is consistent about this. The individual identities of the warriors who underwent the rubric did not simply cease to exist. They are present in some form within their sealed armor, dimly aware, unable to express that awareness in any meaningful way, trapped in a state that is neither the full existence they had before nor the nothingness that death represents. There is a passage in the Warhammer lore describing a Rubric Marine's experience from the inside, a voice saying that it has hands but cannot touch, that it has no mouth but has been screaming since its fall began, that it wants to breathe but cannot remember what breathing felt like, only what drowning feels like, that it sinks without ever hitting bottom. Magnus, when he saw what had been done to his sons by the rubric, was horrified. He had spent his entire life protecting the 1,000 Suns, and what Ahriman had protected them from, the grotesque dissolution of the flesh change, was real and terrible. But what he had protected them into was not better. It was different, and in some ways it was worse, because the flesh change at least ended. The soldiers who fell to its final stages were gone, their suffering over. The Rubric Marines would not end. Their armor would stand for 10,000 years, animated by sorcerers who directed them like chess pieces, and whatever remained of the original people inside those shells would persist through all of it. The Rubric Marines are, in the symbolic vocabulary of 40k, the final expression of what happens when you try to save something by controlling it so completely that the thing you were trying to save no longer exists in the form you were saving it from. Ahriman wanted to protect the Thousand Suns from mutation. He succeeded, in the most technical and hollow sense possible. The Marines are not mutating. They are also not thinking, or feeling, or growing, or doing any of the things that made them worth protecting in the first place. Magnus's own history echoes this. The Emperor tried to protect humanity from the warp by keeping the truth about its secret, by controlling the narrative about what psychic power was and how it worked. Magnus tried to protect his sons by learning enough about the warp to manage its dangers. Ahriman tried to protect the Thousand Suns by applying Magnus's own accumulated knowledge, inner working whose scope exceeded his control. At every level of this story, the same pattern repeats. The protection becomes more harmful than the threat. It is, in the end, the Tzientchian irony running through everything. Change that you refuse to acknowledge or engage with honestly does not go away. It accumulates until it expresses itself in forms you were completely unprepared for. The flesh change could not be stopped by bargaining for a cure or by drilling discipline into warriors who carried the mutation in their genes. The warp could not be safely managed by pretending its inhabitants didn't have their own agenda. The Emperor's project could not be protected by keeping it secret from the son whose help it most needed. Everything that was kept inside eventually got out. And that is, perhaps, the last lesson of Magnus the Red's story. For all his extraordinary intelligence and his genuine commitment to doing right, he was never quite able to reconcile the truth of what he saw with the institutional and emotional frameworks that surrounded him. He saw the warp clearly, more clearly than almost anyone. He saw what the entities in it wanted and how they operated. He saw Horus's corruption before anyone else and tried to stop it. He saw the Council of Nicaea for the predetermined verdict it was. He saw, in those final moments on Prospero, that even his last act of resistance had been planned by Tzeentch to serve Tzeentch's purposes. And he acted on what he saw every time, with the full force of his conviction, and produced catastrophe. Because seeing clearly is not the same as being free. And in the grim darkness of the far future, freedom from the forces that want to use you is the one thing that neither intelligence nor love nor righteous intent is sufficient to guarantee. Magnus the Red knew this. He had learned it at the most brutal possible price. He knows it still. Expanded section. The Great Ocean. What Magnus saw that others didn't. There is a term the Thousand Suns used for the warp during the era of the Great Crusade, a term that distinguished their philosophical relationship to the dimension from the way most of the Imperium thought about it. They called it the Great Ocean. And the metaphor is important to understand because it captures something about their orientation that the word warp doesn't. The warp is a word that suggests disruption, distortion, damage. Something that warps is something that has been bent out of its proper shape by force. To travel through the warp in standard imperial framing is to plunge into a hostile and alien dimension and to endure its hostility long enough to come out the other side. The warp is the danger, the thing to be guarded against, the reason Geller fields exist, and navigators are necessary, and astropaths are soul-bound. It is a resource in the way that an ocean is a resource for sailors, but it is an enemy resource that you use against its will. The Great Ocean suggests something different. An ocean is not hostile to the creatures that live within it. It is simply an environment, vast and complex and following rules that can be learned. Some creatures are dangerous within it, certainly. Storms are dangerous within it. Navigation requires skill and knowledge and the right equipment. But the ocean itself is not malevolent. It does not want you to fail. It is simply itself, and your success in it depends on how well you understand what it is and how it works. Magnus saw the warp as the Great Ocean. He believed, on the basis of years of disciplined study, that produced genuine results, that the entities within the warp had their own natures that could be understood and therefore to some degree predicted and navigated. Not befriended, not controlled, but mapped. He believed that the danger of the warp came not from the warp itself, but from the ignorance that most humans brought to it, the refusal to look at it honestly, the insistence on treating it as simply an enemy environment when it was actually a complex one with rules that rewarded understanding. He was, in most respects, right about this. The problem was that one of the entities whose nature could be understood was Tzeentch, and Tzeentch's nature included the specific ability to appear comprehensible while operating at a level of complexity that made comprehension an illusion. Magnus thought he understood enough of the great ocean to navigate it safely. What he actually understood was the surface of a depth that went down further than his extraordinary mind could reach, in a dimension where the deepest things knew he was there and had been watching him since he first looked in. The tragedy of Magnus's relationship to the warp is not that he tried to understand it. His instinct to study it rather than simply fear it was correct, and in a universe slightly different from the one 40k describes, might have led to the breakthroughs he was looking for. The tragedy is that the specific domain he chose to explore contained within it a force that was better at the thing he was trying to do, that could model his thinking and predict his actions and arrange the conditions of his choices with more precision than he could model and predict it. He brought a knife to a fight where the opponent had been practicing with knives for longer than human civilization had existed. What Magnus could have learned, had things gone differently, is that the appropriate response to that realization is not to study harder. It is to step back from the game entirely, to refuse to play on the board where the opponent has every advantage, to find a different domain, or to accept that some knowledge is not worth the price of the pursuit. He never quite learned this. And in the 41st millennium, he is still pursuing the same project, still trying to navigate the great ocean, still believing that understanding is sufficient protection against what understanding cannot reach. Under Tzeentch's colors now, with different stated goals and a different institutional framework, but with the same essential conviction that he, Magnus the Red, can comprehend enough of what surrounds him to shape it to his purposes. Perhaps he can. The law leaves this genuinely open. Perhaps in some future engagement with the forces of the Imperium, or with the other Chaos Primarchs, or with the entities that have been managing his choices since before he was born, Magnus will finally play a move that even Tzeentch didn't see coming. Perhaps the fractured Primarch who lost his eye and his world and his sons and his father and his soul will find a way to extract value from the board that no one else can. It would be the most Tzeentchian outcome of all, after everything. Expect it, and do not be surprised if expecting it is itself part of the plan. Bridge note. On the nature of the Crimson King's loneliness. One final thing before we return to the broader shape of the story. There is an element of Magnus's existence that the lore touches on only obliquely, but that feels present in nearly every account of him across the centuries. And that is the specific quality of his isolation. Not loneliness in the simple sense of being alone, though he has spent enormous portions of his existence alone in that tower above Sortiarius. Something more particular. The isolation of being the person in the room who sees everything most clearly, and is therefore the least able to share what they see with the people around them. Magnus knew things he couldn't explain to his brothers, because his brothers didn't have the framework to understand the explanation. He knew things he couldn't fully tell his father, because his father was, in this domain, his competitor, rather than simply his teacher. He knew things he couldn't tell his sons without putting them in danger, and things he chose not to tell them out of what he thought was protection, but turned out to be a different kind of abandonment. The person who knows the most often has the least community around their knowledge, and in Magnus's case, the knowledge he carried was specifically and precisely the kind that isolated rather than connected, that showed you the architecture of manipulation underneath the surface of events, in ways that made it very difficult to simply trust and love and act without calculation. He was, from his earliest consciousness, aware of his own creation. He was, from before birth, in communication with a being whose love was real, but whose honesty was strategic. He was, throughout his life, the clearest-eyed person in nearly every room, burdened with a clarity that was never quite enough to save anyone, including himself. That is, perhaps, the final dimension of what the Emperor feared. Not just Magnus's power, or his independence, or his knowledge. The fear of being truly understood by someone whose understanding you cannot fully reciprocate. The fear of being seen. Section 10. 10,000 years, and the Crimson King returns. The tower on the planet of sorcerers is perhaps one of the most evocative images in all of Warhammer 40k's visual and narrative language. It is called the Tower of the Cyclops, and from its apex burns what is described as the Eye of Magnus, a blazing psychic light that functions as a beacon and a symbol and an observatory all at once. From that height, looking out across the roiling surface of Sortiarius and through the psychic storms of the Eye of Terror and into the real space beyond, Magnus the Demon Primarch has spent 10,000 years watching, scheming, and sometimes descending to act in person on specific goals. Those 10 millennia are not a uniform stretch of inactivity. They are punctuated by moments of direct intervention, by campaigns and raids and elaborate plots, by the occasional venture out of the Eye of Terror and into the material universe. But they are also characterized by a quality that the lore describes with some consistency as aloofness, a growing detachment from the concerns of the mortal world, a deepening immersion in the great game that the Chaos Gods play with each other and with the rest of the galaxy. Magnus became, over those centuries, increasingly the instrument of Tzeentch rather than the independent actor he had always believed himself to be. The most significant event in the post-heresy millennium, before the closing years of the 41st millennium, was the Battle of the Fang. This was Magnus's first major return to the material universe in his full capacity as a demon Primarch, and he chose his target with the kind of careful, patient malice that 10,000 years of resentment can produce. He went after the Space Wolves. The Fang is the space, Wolves' fortress, carved into a mountain range on the world of Fenris, one of the most formidable military installations in the entire Imperium. It is designed to be impregnable, and in most contexts, the assessment is accurate. Magnus brought the Thousand Suns against it, while most of the Space Wolves' strength was elsewhere, engaged in campaigns that had drawn the bulk of their combat force off-world, leaving the Fang defended by a much-reduced garrison. For 40 days and nights, the Thousand Suns besieged the Fang. The Space Wolves, badly outnumbered, were forced to fall back deep into the fortress, awakening their most ancient warrior, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a dreadnought who had fought at the Siege of Terror itself to aid in the defense. The battle ended without a decisive victory for either side. Magnus, in his demon Primarch form, proved too powerful for the remaining Space Wolves defenders to contain. But when the Space Wolves fleet returned and the Thousand Suns faced engagement on multiple fronts, they withdrew back into the warp. The Fang stood, but the Space Wolves had paid in blood, and crucially, the Battle of the Fang resulted in the taint of Magnus's psychic influence being introduced into the Space Wolves' gene seed. A subtle corruption, not enough to immediately destroy the chapter, but enough to create complications that would express themselves across subsequent generations, most visibly in the emergence of the Wolfen, Space Wolves, who had undergone a savage mutation into something between man and beast. It was, in other words, a very Tzeentchian kind of victory. Not a straightforward conquest, but a seeded complication, a planted uncertainty that would bear poisonous fruit for centuries. In the later years of the 41st millennium, Magnus remained active in the Great Game, occasionally using agents and proxies to pursue specific goals, rather than committing himself fully. He attempted to steal the Spear of Russ, an artifact sacred to the Space Wolves, through his sorcerer Maddox, with the intention of using it to resurrect some of the Thousand Suns fallen. He was thwarted in this by Ragnar Blackmane, then a young but extraordinarily capable space wolf. His operations in this period reflect a pattern: long-term planning with patience, the gradual setting up of conditions that wouldn't pay off for decades or centuries, with occasional direct interventions at precisely chosen moments. Then, in the closing years of the 41st millennium, everything changed simultaneously. The 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon's most ambitious assault on the Imperium yet, an invasion on a scale not seen since the heresy itself. The formation of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, a tear in reality stretching across the entire galaxy that fundamentally changed the shape of the war between the Imperium and Chaos. The resurrection of Reboot Guilliman, brought back to life by Belisarius Cawl and the Elder, a Primarch returning to a galaxy 10,000 years removed from when he had last seen it. Magnus responded to these events with something that had been building for a very long time. The siege of the Fenris system was not just a revenge attack on the Space Wolves. It was the culminating move in a plan that Magnus had been constructing across centuries, seeding corruptions and manipulations and carefully laid preparations that had been designed from the beginning to achieve something much larger than simple vengeance. The attack on Fenris drew the Space Wolves home to defend their world, as Magnus had anticipated. Thousand Suns' silver towers descended across the planet's surface, each one the site of coordinated rituals conducted by Thousand Suns' sorcerers. For 9 hours, 9 minutes, and 9 seconds, the combined ritual worked, and Magnus himself was summoned to the material universe in full demon Primarch form, standing on the surface of the world where he had watched his sons be murdered 10,000 years. Earlier, Space Wolves fell, Grey Knights fell, Dark Angels fell. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf, managed to land a blow that allowed the Grey Knights to work their banishment rituals, and Magnus was pushed back into the warp. But he had gotten exactly what he came for: the sacrifice of the population of Midgardia, a death world in the Fenris system that had been infected with a hideous plague and subsequently destroyed by Exterminatus, powered a ritual of staggering scope. The planet of sorcerers, Sortiarius, which had been deep inside the Eye of Terror since the end of the Horus Heresy, was torn through the veil between the warp and reality and relocated. It emerged into real space directly above the ruins of Prospero. Magnus had brought his world home, the scholar's planet, the world of libraries and glass towers and accumulated knowledge, now orbited by a demon world, inhabited by sorcerers and their automaton warriors. The symbolic weight of this was not lost on anyone observing it, and the violent transition of the planet of sorcerers into reality created a new warp rift in the region, adding to the broader instability that was already fracturing the galaxy. Then, Reboot Guilliman rose, and Magnus saw an opportunity of a different kind. Guilliman had been resurrected on Macragge, and was attempting to reach Terra to meet his gene father, the Emperor, for the first time in 10,000 years, to assess the state of the Imperium he had left, and figure out what could be done to save it. He assembled a vast fleet, the Terran Crusade, and began the journey. The warp was in turmoil, making every transition difficult, every jump unpredictable. Magnus intercepted the Terran Crusade near the Maelstrom. He came in person, his flagship a vessel shaped like an enormous pyramid, a floating monument to the Great Pyramid of Tizca that the Space Wolves had destroyed on Prospero. He had no desire to kill Guilliman, not yet. Instead, he cast a ritual that grabbed the Terran Crusade fleet and hurled it into the depths of the Maelstrom, trapping Guilliman in the labyrinthine warp rift for an indefinite period. Guilliman eventually escaped through a sequence of events involving Elder help and Harlequin guidance, and a passage through the webway. But at every step of that escape, Thousand Suns were there to contest the path. And when Guilliman emerged on Luna, Magnus himself was there, in physical form, to fight his brother directly. The duel between Magnus and Guilliman on the surface of Earth's moon is one of the more remarkable moments in recent 40,000 canon. two Primarchs, each representing opposite poles of what Primarchs could be. Guilliman, who had rejected the warp entirely, and whose approach to fighting chaos was always to cut through it with rationality and discipline and overwhelming institutional force. Magnus, who had embraced the warp so completely that he was now one of the most powerful expressions of its nature in existence, a being whose inner, life and physical reality were both steeped in the currents of the Imperium. Magnus had the upper hand initially. His psychic power overwhelmed Guilliman's defenses. But then the Sisters of Silence arrived from Terra, and their null field began to suppress the psychic environment around the battle. Magnus, who was psychically dependent in a way that Guilliman was not, found his advantages diminishing. Guilliman drove his sword through Magnus's back. Magnus was forced back through the webway portal as it was sealed behind him. He had failed to prevent Guilliman from reaching Terra, but he had delayed the Primarch of the Ultramarines for a significant period, had cost the Loyalist ships and warriors, had prevented the reinforcement of Terra at a moment when every day of delay mattered. And more broadly, he had announced his return to active participation in galactic affairs in ways that would shape the wars of the New Age. In the era of the Dark Imperium, following the formation of the Great Rift and Guilliman's return, and the beginning of the Indomitus Crusade, Magnus has become one of the most active demon Primarchs. He has led his 1,000 sons against targets across the galaxy, has maneuvered against both Imperial forces and against other Chaos factions in the Great Game. On Prospero, now orbited by Sortiarius, he has been working on something, a long-term project that the lore only partially illuminates, involving the psychic potential of humanity's growing tide of psychers in the age of the Great Rift. The nature of that project, at least partially, is this. Magnus believes that the Emperor's vision was correct in its general shape, but wrong in its methods. The Emperor wanted humanity to become a psychic race, independent of Chaos's influence, capable of navigating the warp rather than being consumed by it. Magnus shares that aspiration, but now serves a different master in pursuing it. Tzeentch's vision for humanity's psychic ascension runs through mutation and change and the embrace of sorcery, rather than through disciplined development and the rejection of warp dependency. Magnus, no longer able to pursue the path his father imagined, pursues the path Tzeentch has shown him, which ends in a very different place. Whether he knows, at some level, that these two visions are incompatible, the lore does not say clearly. Section 11. Why Magnus and not the others? The case made plainly. At some point in a video like this one, it's worth stopping and making the argument directly rather than leaving it implicit in the narrative. So let's ask it plainly. Why Magnus and not any of the other Primarchs? Why not Horus? Horus was the War Master. Horus was the beloved son. Horus, ultimately, was the one who nearly killed the Emperor. If any Primarch should be on a list of things the Emperor feared, shouldn't Horus be the obvious candidate? The answer is that the Emperor's relationship with Horus was fear-adjacent, but not quite fear. What the Emperor experienced around Horus was love, and the particular vulnerability that love creates, the inability to fully see a beloved person as a threat. The Emperor chose Horus as War Master, partly out of genuine assessment of his capabilities, and partly out of the blind spot that affection creates. He didn't send a hidden executioner to Horus's meetings. He didn't design fail-safes against Horus's potential actions. He trusted Horus so completely that even when Magnus warned him about the corruption, he couldn't process the warning. That's not the behavior of someone who fears their subject. That's the behavior of someone who loved too well to see clearly. Why not Lorgar? Lorgar was actively reaching toward chaos, was building the theological framework that would become the word-bearer's path to damnation, was already in deep consultation with entities the Emperor explicitly wanted humans to avoid. The Emperor eventually noticed, and his response was devastating. He sent the Ultramarines and the Word-Bearer's sister legion to Lorgar's pride world of Monarchia, and had it reduced to rubble in front of him as a public humiliation. a statement that the emperor made Lorgar kneel in the ruins of the city Lorgar had built in his honor. That is contempt and correction, not fear. The emperor didn't hide a contingency force at the edges of his conversations with Lorgar. Why not Mortarion? Mortarion was already compromised in ways that would eventually manifest as his fall to Nurgle. But Mortarion's particular form of corruption operated below the surface, and the Emperor didn't see it clearly until it was too late. There's no evidence of the Emperor arranging specific containment measures around Mortarion the way he did around Magnus. Why not Angron? Angron was arguably the most dangerous being alive in terms of raw destructive capacity. The butcher's nails implanted in his skull drove him toward violence with a compulsion that even his Primarch physiology couldn't fully override. He was, functionally, a weapon that had been aimed by the Emperor and occasionally redirected, but never fully controlled. Yet the Emperor doesn't seem to have feared Angron in the way that matters here. Angron's violence was predictable. It was terrible, but it followed clear patterns. You knew what Angron would do because Angron always did the same thing. Magnus was different from all of them because he was operating in the Emperor's domain, not the domain of military conquest, where most of the Primarchs lived, the domain of psychic power, of warp knowledge, of the kind of insights that could change the shape of reality if applied correctly. And he was approaching the Emperor's level in that domain in a way that none of the other Primarchs came close to matching. The Emperor could monitor Horus through normal military intelligence. He could redirect Lorgar through humiliation and command. He could aim Angron at appropriate targets. But with Magnus, the Emperor was in the position of someone watching a student who is learning so fast that they might soon exceed the teacher's ability to guide them. The knowledge Magnus was accumulating had its own trajectory, and not all of it went through channels the Emperor could inspect. The Webway project dependency made this fear existential rather than merely philosophical. The Emperor needed Magnus to fulfill a specific, irreplaceable function in his greatest plan. But Magnus, as an individual, had his own understanding of what was right and what was necessary, and had already demonstrated that he was willing to act on that understanding against the Emperor's explicit instructions. The collision between these two realities, the Emperor's need and the Emperor's distrust, is what makes the whole relationship so tragic. There is also something worth noting about what Magnus represented in terms of the Emperor's own psychology. The Emperor had, for all his extraordinary capabilities, chosen a path for humanity that required denying certain truths about the universe. The Imperial truth was not fully honest about what the warp was. The Emperor knew this. He made this choice deliberately for reasons that he believed were good. A humanity that believed in gods was a humanity more vulnerable to the gods that actually existed and wanted to consume human souls. Better to build the discipline and rationality of atheism first, then reveal the fuller picture when humanity was strong enough to handle it. Magnus never accepted the lie. He kept looking at the warp and telling people what he actually saw there, kept insisting that honest inquiry rather than managed ignorance was the only sustainable approach to the dangers the universe contained. In this way, Magnus was a kind of walking critique of the Emperor's chosen method, a constant reminder that the strategy might be wrong. And the Emperor, who did not respond well to having his strategies questioned, and who had enormous emotional investment in the Imperial truth as a framework, found Magnus's persistent refusal to simply accept the official version deeply uncomfortable. Fear, in this context, is not quite the right word for every element of what the Emperor felt about Magnus. It was more complex than that. It was concern and need and distrust, and something approaching admiration layered over the fundamental anxiety of someone who could not fully predict what this particular son was going to do next. Among all the Primarchs, Magnus was the one who most clearly had his own agenda, his own set of values that he was going to follow, regardless of what the Emperor said about it. And unlike the Primarchs whose independent values were simply about personal glory, or hatred of Xenos, or devotion to their homeworld, Magnus's independent values were in the same territory as the Emperor's most important project. That is why the Emperor feared him, not because Magnus was an enemy, because Magnus was a necessary ally who couldn't be fully trusted in a situation where being wrong about the trust was catastrophic. Section 12. The tragedy of it all. And what remains. There is a version of Warhammer 40k's history in which Magnus the Red is the story's greatest hero. In that version, Magnus warns the Emperor in time, and the Emperor believes him. Horus's corruption is addressed before it can metastasize into the full heresy. The Thousand Sons keep fighting as the psychic vanguard of the crusade, the Scholar's Legion that does what brute force alone never could. The Webway project succeeds, and humanity moves through the galaxy without having to pass through the dimension where its enemies live. The Emperor's grand plan reaches its conclusion something like intact. That version doesn't exist. Instead, we have the version we have. And in the version we have, there is a kind of distributed responsibility for the catastrophe that is almost uniquely fair in its cruelty. Tzeentch planned it and provided the extra power that made the Webway breach catastrophic rather than merely damaging. The Emperor built his project in secret rather than trusting anyone with it, which meant that Magnus couldn't have known what he was doing even if he'd been more careful. Magnus used forbidden power in violation of explicit orders because he believed the need justified it, which is a defensible position on the merits, but catastrophically wrong in practice. Horus lied to Russ and changed the order from capture to execution, which turned a response to Magnus's violation into something much worse. Russ executed those orders without attempting to verify them, because some part of him was glad to have permission to do what he had always wanted to do. Everyone made choices. Some of those choices were more guilty than others. But the galaxy that emerges from this cascade of choices is the 40,000 we know, where the Emperor sits immobile on a throne that was supposed to free humanity, where the Thousand Sons are mostly dust in hollow armor, where an extraordinary mind that could have been the bridge between human psychic potential and safe navigation of the universe serves instead as the champion of the god who manipulated him from the beginning. Magnus is, in many ways, the figure who shows most clearly what Warhammer 40,000 is really doing underneath its surface of explosions and power armor and dramatic combat. It is doing tragedy. It is doing a story about how the universe doesn't care about your intentions, about how being right about the facts and wrong about the method produces the same outcome as being wrong about everything, about how the people trying hardest to save something are often the ones who end up destroying it, not through malice, but through the specific blindness that intelligence creates when it becomes convinced of its own sufficiency. Magnus genuinely thought he was smarter than the warp. He had good reasons for thinking this, because he was smarter than almost everything else he had ever encountered. But the warp isn't an intellectual problem to be solved. It is a predatory environment that specifically targets the things that make you think you're equipped to handle it. Your ambition, your curiosity, your love for the people you're trying to protect, your conviction that the rules apply to lesser minds and not to yours. Tzeentch, who is in some sense the embodiment of the very cognitive architecture that makes Magnus who he is, had been running this specific play for Magnus's entire life. And now, in the era Indomitus, Magnus stands on a world above the ruins of Prospero and looks out at a galaxy tearing itself apart and pursues goals that are recognizable echoes of the goals he always had. He still wants humanity to ascend psychically. He still believes that knowledge is the most important thing. He still operates through elaborate planning and indirect methods rather than through simple, overwhelming force. But the framework has changed. He serves Tzeentch now, and the psychic ascension he envisions is one that runs through change and chaos, and the sorcerous transformation of humanity, rather than through the careful, disciplined path his father was trying to build. Whether he still grieves the original path, whether somewhere in that tower, the part of him that was once a scholar on Prospero still mourns what might have been, the lore leaves appropriately ambiguous. That ambiguity is part of what makes Magnus such a compelling figure. He is not simply a villain. He is not simply a tragic hero. He is something more specific and more interesting. A person of genuine brilliance and genuine love, in the wrong universe at the wrong time, who kept doing the right thing by his own values and producing catastrophe by the universe's measure. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the one Primarch who the Emperor of mankind could never quite bring himself to fully trust, and whose story tells you more about the nature of that grim darkness than almost any other single piece of lore in this extraordinary setting. That is who he was. That is what he became. That is what it meant for a god to fear. And that is why, of all the Emperor's sons, Magnus the Red stands alone as the Primarch who truly unsettled his father in ways that went beyond strategy and crossed into something much more personal and much more frightening. If you've made it this far, thank you genuinely for spending this time with me on this one. Magnus's story is one I find myself returning to again and again because it rewards the attention. Every time you go back through it with fresh eyes, there is something new to notice, some choice that lands differently, some moment where the tragedy crystallizes in a way that feels more acute than it did before. If you want to read the novels and experience the story in full detail, I would strongly recommend starting with 1,000 Suns by Graham McNeill, which covers the Great Crusade through the burning of Prospero from the 1,000 Suns perspective, and then Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, which covers the same events from the Space Wolves side. The two books are designed to be read together, and the way they illuminate the same events from opposite perspectives is genuinely one of the most impressive things the Horus Heresy novel series achieved. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think, and it tells me that this kind of long-form deep dive is worth continuing to make. If you want to see more lore content like this, where we take one of 40k's most layered figures and spend real time with everything they represent, then subscribing so you don't miss the next one would mean a lot. We have a lot more to explore in this setting. The stories are there, patient and extraordinary, waiting for someone to sit down and really look at them. Until next time, stay curious, stay patient, and remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, the most dangerous thing you can be is genuinely, irreversibly right.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.